The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Evelyn's small, modest home in Maplewood, Vermont, casting a gentle glow over the well-worn furniture. The house was a testament to years of love and quiet sacrifice, simple, unadorned, yet filled with warmth. Evelyn stirred before dawn, as she had every day for the past 23 years. Her movements were methodical, unhurried. At 64, her body bore the signs of age. Wrinkles creased her face, her hands were roughened from years of work, and a slight stiffness had settled in her joints. She quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Lucas, whose room was just down the hall. In the kitchen, she filled the kettle and set it on the stove, the familiar whistle signaling the start of another day. As the water boiled, she began preparing breakfast: slices of bread, a small block of cheese, and an apple, which she carefully peeled and sliced. The aroma of fresh coffee soon filled the kitchen, mingling with the scent of toast. Evelyn moved through the motions with a sense of purpose, though her thoughts were elsewhere. She often found herself drifting back to the past, to the days when Lucas was a boy, full of energy and dreams. Those memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the reality of the accident that had changed everything. She didn't dwell on them long. There was too much to do. By the time the first light of day seeped into the sky, breakfast was ready. Evelyn carried the tray to Lucas's room, pausing at the door to collect herself. She pushed it open with her shoulder, a warm smile already forming on her lips. "Good morning, Lucas," she greeted softly. Lucas, a man of 35 with the face of someone who had seen too much, turned his head slightly to meet her gaze. His body, still and unyielding, lay cocooned in the blankets. His eyes, however, were bright, and a small smile played on his lips. "Morning, Mom," he replied, his voice hoarse from sleep. Evelyn set the tray on the small table beside his bed and began the slow, careful process of helping him sit up. It was a routine they had perfected over the years. Evelyn's hands, gentle but firm as she guided him, Lucas's movements deliberate and controlled. They didn't need to speak. Each knew what the other needed. Once Lucas was propped up with pillows, Evelyn placed the tray on his lap. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching as he took a bite of toast. "How did you sleep?" she asked, her tone casual, though her eyes searched his face for any sign of discomfort. "All right," Lucas replied between bites. Had that dream again. Evelyn's heart tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. The dream, Lucas walking through a sunlit field, his legs strong and sure, the breeze on his face, had haunted him for years. It was a cruel reminder of what had been taken from him, but Evelyn knew better than to dwell on it. She simply nodded. "They're just dreams, Lucas," she said gently, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from his forehead. "We have today." Lucas nodded, though his gaze drifted to the window. "I know." The conversation lapsed into a comfortable silence, punctuated only by the clinking of the cup and plate. Evelyn took solace in these quiet moments, where the world narrowed to just the two of them. It was in these silences that she felt closest to him, where words weren't necessary to convey the depth of her love. When breakfast was finished, Evelyn cleared the tray and set it aside. She moved with the same steady calm as she helped Lucas wash and dress for the day. The tasks were simple, yet they required a patience that had become second nature to her. She never hurried, never showed signs of fatigue, though the strain of years weighed on her. As she guided Lucas into his wheelchair, Evelyn couldn't help but marvel at how far they had come. The early years after the accident had been the hardest, Lucas's despair, her own grief, but they had found a rhythm, a way to move forward together. There was no need for grand gestures or declarations. Their bond was forged in the quiet, everyday acts of care and devotion. By mid-morning, Lucas was settled in the living room, the television on, though he wasn't really watching. Evelyn hovered nearby, her hands busy with a basket of laundry. The room was filled with the soft sounds of domestic life, the hum of the washing machine, the rustle of clothes being folded, the faint murmur of the TV. Evelyn stood at the kitchen sink, her hands moving automatically as she washed the breakfast dishes. Through the window, she watched the leaves fall from the maple tree in the yard, their slow descent a reminder of the passage of time. She could hear the low murmur of the television in the living room where Lucas sat. Though she knew his attention wasn't on the screen, his silences had grown longer, more introspective, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The clatter of a dish brought her back to the present, but the memory had already taken root, pulling her back to that day, the day when everything changed. It had been an ordinary afternoon, the kind that passes without much notice. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, casting a muted light over the town. They were returning home from a weekend trip to visit David's parents. Lucas, just 12 years old, had been brimming with energy, recounting stories from the weekend as he bounced in the back seat, his voice a constant stream of excitement. "Dad, did you see how high I climbed in that tree? I was almost at the top." Lucas's voice was clear, filled with the exuberance of youth. David had glanced at Evelyn with a smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're going to give your mum a heart attack with stunts like that, buddy." Evelyn had laughed, shaking her head. "Just be careful next time, okay? You're not indestructible, you know." Lucas had grinned back at them from the rear-view mirror, his face flushed with pride. "I'm fine, Mum. I know what I'm doing." Those words, so carefree, so full of life, had echoed in Evelyn's mind countless times since. She had been about to respond when the car had lurched violently. The road, slick from the recent rain, had caught them off guard. There was a moment of confusion, of terror, as David tried to regain control, but it was too late. The car skidded, spinning out of control before slamming into the guardrail. The sound of metal tearing, glass shattering, it was a cacophony that would haunt her forever. And then, silence. Evelyn had woken to a world that was at once familiar and utterly alien. The car was still, the rain now a light drizzle. David's seat was empty, the door flung open. Panic gripped her chest as she struggled to turn to see. Lucas's small frame was crumpled in the back seat, his eyes closed, his body unnervingly still. "Lucas," she had whispered, her voice cracking. "Lucas, please." But there had been no response. She had reached out, her hand trembling as she touched his face. It was warm. He was alive. Relief had flooded her, quickly followed by the gut-wrenching realization that David wasn't beside her. She had turned to see him lying on the road, motionless, and in that moment, she knew. The pain was swift, searing, but she pushed it down, focusing on the son who still needed her. The hospital was a blur of white coats, medical jargon, and sterile smells. The doctors spoke in hushed tones, their faces grave. Severe spinal injury, paralysis likely permanent. The words sliced through her, but Evelyn had stood stoic, determined not to break. Lucas needed her to be strong. In the weeks that followed, the reality of their new life set in. The house that once echoed with laughter and the easy banter between father and son grew quiet. David's absence was a wound that festered, but Evelyn bore it in silence, channeling her grief into caring for Lucas. He was all she had left, and she would not fail him. Now, standing at the window, Evelyn's eyes clouded with unshed tears. She had grown accustomed to their life, quiet, routine, grounded in small moments of care and love. But Lucas was changing. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the distant look that often crossed his face. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but after 23 years, she knew him too well to dismiss it as nothing. Evelyn dried her hands on a towel, steeling herself. The past had a way of resurfacing when you least expected it, and she couldn't help but wonder if Lucas's recent behavior was tied to that day, to the life they had lost. The thought was like a splinter, small but persistent, and it lodged itself in her mind, refusing to be ignored. She moved to the living room, watching Lucas from the doorway. He sat in his chair, staring at the television, but his eyes were unfocused, his mind elsewhere. The sight of him, so still, so distant, sent a pang through her heart. Whatever was troubling him, she would find a way to help. She had to, because the alternative was too painful to bear. The evening light filtered through the lace curtains in Evelyn's living room, casting soft patterns on the worn wooden floor. The house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the television in the background. Evelyn sat in her usual chair, knitting needles in hand, but her focus was elsewhere. Her eyes kept drifting to Lucas, who was sitting across from her, seemingly absorbed in the TV. Evelyn's hands stilled as she watched him, her mind churning with a mix of emotions. For the past few weeks, she had noticed subtle changes in Lucas. They were small things, almost imperceptible to anyone else. An occasional twitch of his leg, the way his eyes would cloud over as if he was lost in thought, the slight shifts in his posture. At first, she had dismissed them as her imagination, a desperate hope manifesting in small observations. But now, she wasn't so sure. "Lucas," she called softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Are you feeling all right?" Lucas turned his head slowly, his expression neutral. "I'm fine, Mum. Just tired." She nodded, forcing a smile. "It's been a long day at the clinic." "Yee," he agreed, though his tone lacked conviction. "It's nothing. I'll be okay." Evelyn resumed her knitting, though her mind was far from the pattern she was working on. The clinic visits had become a routine for them, a part of the life they had adapted to after the accident. Dr. Emily Carson, Lucas's physiotherapist, was kind and patient, always encouraging Lucas to push his limits, but never beyond what was safe. Still, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was different now, something Lucas wasn't telling her. Later that night, after Lucas had gone to bed, Evelyn found herself pacing the kitchen, her mind replaying the day's events. The doubt gnawed at her, an unwelcome companion that refused to be silenced. What if Lucas was hiding something from her? What if those small movements she had seen weren't just reflexes, but signs of something more? And what if she was wrong, and she was only seeing what she desperately wanted to see? Evelyn leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the edge. The thought of confronting Lucas made her stomach twist. What if she asked him, and he denied it? What if he confirmed her fears? She had lived with hope for so long, clinging to the possibility that one day Lucas might walk again. But hope, she had learned, could be a double-edged sword, cutting deeper with each disappointment. As she stood there, her mind settled on an idea, a small, almost guilty thought that quickly grew into something more concrete. She could find out the truth without asking him directly. She could observe, see for herself, if there was anything to these suspicions. The thought made her feel uneasy, but it was the only way she could be sure. The next morning, while Lucas was still asleep, Evelyn made her way to the local security shop. It was a small place, tucked between the bakery and the pharmacy, its window display filled with an assortment of cameras and alarms. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered, and a young man behind the counter looked up with a friendly smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Evelyn hesitated, the guilt already creeping in. I need to install some cameras at home just for security." The young man nodded, not questioning her further. "We have a few options. Are you looking for something discreet? Yes, she replied quickly. Something small, easy to set up. He showed her a few models, explaining the features, but Evelyn's mind was only half listening. She made her choice quickly, paying for the cameras and accepting the box with trembling hands. As she left the store, she felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This wasn't what she wanted to do, but it felt necessary, the only way to find out the truth without burdening Lucas with her fears. Back at home, she waited until Lucas was out for his therapy session before she set to work. The cameras were small, easy to hide. She placed one in the living room, another in the hallway, and a third in his bedroom. As she finished, she stood back, feeling a wave of guilt wash over her. Was this really the right thing to do? But the doubt, that gnawing doubt, wouldn't let her rest. She needed to know, even if it meant crossing a line she had never thought she would. Days passed, each one filled with the quiet tension of waiting. Evelyn kept herself busy, but her mind was always on the cameras, on what they might reveal. She checked the footage every night, her heart pounding as she watched. The first few days showed nothing unusual. Lucas, moving through the house as he always did, his routine unchanged. But then, one evening, Evelyn sat at the edge of her bed, the dim glow of the laptop casting shadows across the room. Her heart pounded in her chest as she opened the folder containing the camera footage. The file names blurred together as her mind raced, a mix of fear and hope tightening her throat. She clicked on the most recent video, her fingers trembling slightly, and settled back to watch. The screen showed the familiar scene of the living room, Lucas sitting on the couch, the television murmuring softly in the background. For a moment everything seemed as it always was, mundane and unchanged. But then she saw it. A slight twitch, barely noticeable, in Lucas's leg. Her breath caught. It happened again, this time more pronounced. He shifted slightly, his hand gripping the armrest as if in an attempt to move. Evelyn's eyes widened, her heart racing. It wasn't her imagination. This was real. Lucas was trying to move. The realization hit her like a wave, a rush of conflicting emotions. Joy, fear, disbelief, all at once. Her thoughts spiraled. How long had this been happening? Why hadn't he told her? She clicked through more footage, her hope mingling with dread. Each clip confirmed what she had begun to suspect. Lucas was making subtle attempts to regain movement. But why had he kept it a secret? The question gnawed at her, pulling her into a whirlpool of anxiety. With a deep breath, Evelyn stood and made her way to the living room, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had seen. Lucas was there, as usual, his eyes fixed on the television, but his mind clearly elsewhere. She hesitated at the doorway, gathering her courage before stepping into the room. "Lucas," she said softly, her voice betraying the tension she felt. He looked up, his expression neutral at first, but then something flickered in his eyes. Anxiety, perhaps, or fear. "Yeah, Mum." She sat down beside him, the words catching in her throat. I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." Lucas tensed, his gaze dropping to his hands. "What is it?" Evelyn took a steadying breath. I've seen you trying to move your legs. I saw it in the footage. Why didn't you tell me?" The silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. Lucas's face paled, and for a moment he looked like a child caught in a lie. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it, struggling to find the words. "I didn't want to say anything because I wasn't sure," he finally admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure if it was real or just my body playing tricks on me." Evelyn's heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice. "Lucas, you can tell me anything. You know that, don't you?" He nodded, but the conflict was clear on his face. "I was afraid, Mom. Afraid that if I told you it would just make things harder. What if it's nothing? What if it's just temporary? I didn't want to get your hopes up only to disappoint you again." Tears welled up in Evelyn's eyes, but she blinked them away, reaching out to take Lucas's hand in hers. "You could never disappoint me, Lucas. Never. I'm here for you no matter what. We've been through too much together for you to hide this from me." Lucas looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I didn't want to be a burden, Mum. You've done so much for me already. I didn't want to add to that." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her voice firm but gentle. "You are my son, Lucas. There's nothing you could do that would make me think of you as a burden. If there's even a chance that you're getting better, we need to know. We need to face it together." Lucas took a deep breath, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. "I've been feeling something. I don't know how to describe it. It's like my legs are waking up, but just barely. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure, until I knew it wasn't just in my head." Evelyn nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of hope and empathy. "We'll talk to Dr. Carson. She'll know what to do. But promise me, Lucas, no more secrets. We'll face whatever comes together, okay?" Lucas gave a small, hesitant smile, his hand tightening around hers. "Okay, Mom. I promise." The moment hung between them, heavy with unspoken fears, but also with a renewed sense of hope. For the first time in a long while, Lucas felt the weight on his chest lighten just a bit. The air in the clinic was thick with the scent of antiseptic, a sterile sharpness that Lucas had come to associate with both hope and dread. The small therapy room was bathed in the pale light of a winter morning, the walls lined with equipment that seemed both menacing and inviting. Lucas sat in his wheelchair, his hands resting on the smooth metal of the armrests, waiting for Dr. Emily Carson to begin the day's session. "Ready?" Emily's voice was calm, a steady presence that Lucas had come to rely on. He nodded, though his heart wasn't in it. "As I'll ever be." Emily smiled, but there was a seriousness in her eyes that matched the gravity of the task ahead. "Let's start with the basics, just like before. Remember, it's about consistency, not speed." Lucas nodded again, his throat tight. He wanted to believe her, to trust in the process, but the fear lingered, fear that this would be just another false start, another reminder of what he had lost. Emily positioned herself beside him, her hands firm but gentle as she guided his leg onto the padded table. "We'll focus on control today. Small movements, Lucas. Don't push too hard." He gritted his teeth, willing his body to obey as he tried to lift his leg. The muscles strained, a dull ache spreading through his thigh, but the limb barely moved. A wave of frustration surged through him, sharp and bitter. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, his face flushing with the effort. Emily didn't flinch. "It's okay. We'll get there. One step at a time." Lucas looked at her, searching her face for any sign of doubt, but found none. Emily's expression was calm, determined, as if she believed in him even when he couldn't believe in himself. It was both comforting and unsettling. He tried again, focusing on the sensations in his leg, the tension, the slight tremor in the muscle. Slowly, ever so slowly, his leg lifted from the table just an inch. But it was movement. He felt a flicker of triumph, quickly doused by the effort it had taken to achieve so little. Emily noticed the change in his expression and offered a small nod of encouragement. "That's progress, Lucas. Don't downplay it." He exhaled, the breath shaky. "It doesn't feel like much. But it is." Emily countered gently. These small victories add up. Don't underestimate them. Lucas wanted to believe her, but the doubts lingered, heavy and persistent. What if this was as good as it got? What if these tiny movements were all he could ever achieve? The thought gnawed at him, making each session feel like a battle between hope and despair. They continued the exercises, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. Lucas focused on each movement, each command from Emily, trying to drown out the doubts with sheer determination. But it was exhausting, physically and mentally, and by the end of the session, he was spent. Emily helped him back into his wheelchair, her hands steady as she adjusted the straps. "You did well today, Lucas. It's not easy, I know." He nodded, too tired to speak. The room felt too small, too bright, and he wanted nothing more than to escape to the quiet of his home. But even there, the doubts would follow him. As they made their way out of the clinic, Lucas glanced at Emily, noting the way her brow furrowed slightly in concentration as she walked beside him. There was something about her, something steady, grounding, that kept him from spiraling too far into his own fears. He wasn't sure what it was, but it was enough to make him want to keep coming back, to keep trying. "Emily," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the need to speak, "do you ever wonder if this is all for nothing?" She paused, turning to look at him, her gaze thoughtful. "I think it's natural to have doubts, Lucas. But I also think that every effort we make, no matter how small, is worth something. Maybe we won't get exactly where we want to be, but that doesn't mean we won't get somewhere meaningful." Her words hung in the air between them, offering a quiet reassurance that Lucas hadn't realized he needed. He nodded, swallowing hard. "I guess that's all I can hope for." Emily's smile was soft, understanding. "And that's enough. You're doing the work, Lucas. That's what matters." They reached the entrance, the cold air biting as they stepped outside. Lucas felt the weight of the day's session in his muscles, a reminder of the effort he had put in. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, that would have to be enough. As they parted ways, Lucas watched Emily walk back into the clinic, her figure disappearing into the building. He didn't have all the answers, and the doubts were still there. But something had shifted. The journey was far from over, but with Emily's quiet support, he felt a little more prepared to face whatever came next. The clinic was quiet in the early hours, the hum of fluorescent lights creating a low, steady rhythm that seemed to sync with the slow but deliberate pace of Lucas's progress. The air held a chill that seeped into the bones, but Lucas hardly noticed. His focus was on the task at hand, on the steady, reassuring presence of Emily at his side. "Just a little more, Lucas," Emily encouraged, her voice calm but firm. "You're almost there." Lucas nodded, his face set in concentration. His hands gripped the parallel bars as he took another step, the muscles in his legs trembling with the effort. Each movement was a battle, against the pain, against the fear of failure. But it was a battle he was determined to win. Emily watched him closely, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. She had seen him struggle before, but today was different. Today, there was a determination in him that hadn't been there in the beginning, a resolve that pushed him beyond the limits he had once thought impossible. "Good," Emily said softly as Lucas took another step. "Keep going." He clenched his jaw, pushing himself forward, willing his legs to move. The effort was immense, each step feeling like it took an eternity, but the bar was only a few feet away now. He could do this. He had to do this. Finally, with a final burst of strength, Lucas reached the end of the bars and stood, panting, but upright. Sweat trickled down his forehead, his legs shaking, but he was standing, unaided if only for a moment. The realization hit him slowly, like the warmth of the sun breaking through a cold morning. "I did it," he breathed, almost in disbelief. Emily's smile was small but genuine, a rare crack in her professional demeanor. "Yes, you did." They stood there for a moment, the weight of the achievement hanging in the air between them. Lucas felt a swell of emotion, pride, relief, and something else, something that had been growing between them for weeks now. He glanced at Emily, catching the slight softening in her eyes before she looked away, her expression returning to its usual calm. "Let's get you back to the chair," she said, her tone slipping back into the professional. But Lucas could hear the undercurrent of pride in her voice, the same pride that warmed his own chest. As she helped him back to his wheelchair, their hands brushed for a fleeting moment, and Lucas felt a jolt of something more than just physical connection. It was the kind of moment that lingered, that made him acutely aware of how much he had come to rely on her, not just as his therapist, but as someone who believed in him, even when he struggled to believe in himself. Back in the chair, Lucas leaned back, his breath slowly returning to normal. Emily knelt beside him, adjusting the footrests with the same careful attention she always did, but there was something different in the air now, something unspoken, yet undeniable. "You've come a long way, Lucas," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes as she worked. "I couldn't have done it without you," he replied, his voice equally soft. Emily looked up then, her gaze locking with his. For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. There was a tension between them, a current that neither could ignore, but both were reluctant to acknowledge. "We're a team," she said finally, her voice steady, but Lucas could see the flicker of something more in her eyes. "Yeah," he agreed, though his heart was pounding. "A good team." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. They both knew that their relationship had shifted, that it was no longer just therapist and patient. But neither was ready to cross that line. Not yet. The rest of the session passed in a blur, both of them focused on the task at hand, but the awareness of each other's presence was stronger than ever. When it was time to leave, Emily walked with Lucas to the door, their conversation light, but the tension from earlier still lingered in the air. "See you tomorrow?" she said as they reached the exit. Lucas nodded, offering her a small smile. "Yeah, see you tomorrow." He had stood on his own today, a victory that had seemed impossible just months ago. But it wasn't just the physical progress that filled his thoughts. It was the way Emily had looked at him, the way her hand had lingered just a moment longer than necessary. Back at home, Evelyn noticed the change in him immediately. There was a lightness in his demeanor, a quiet joy that hadn't been there before. She watched him carefully, wondering what had brought about this shift, but she didn't ask. She simply smiled and joined him for dinner, the unspoken understanding between them that today had been a good day, a day of progress. The evening light softened the edges of the living room, casting a warm glow over the worn furniture and well-thumbed books that lined the shelves. The television murmured in the background, but neither Lucas nor Evelyn were paying much attention. They had fallen into their usual routine, Lucas in his chair, Evelyn on the couch beside him. But tonight, the air was heavy with something unspoken. Lucas stared at the flickering screen, his mind miles away. His thoughts kept circling back to Emily, to the moments they had shared, the connection that had grown between them. It wasn't just about the therapy anymore. It was about something deeper, something that had been building slowly, quietly, until it was impossible to ignore. He knew he had to tell his mother, but the thought of it made his stomach twist. He wasn't sure how she would react, wasn't sure if she would understand. But more than that, he wasn't sure if he was ready to face the reality of his own feelings. What if he was making things more complicated than they needed to be? What if it changed everything? Evelyn glanced over at him, sensing his distraction. "Lucas, are you all right? You've been awfully quiet tonight." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. How could he even begin to explain what he was feeling? But he knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. His mother had always been his confidant, the one person he could talk to about anything. This was no different. At least, he hoped it wasn't. "Mum," he began slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." Evelyn muted the TV, turning her full attention to him. Her eyes were filled with concern, but she didn't press him. She simply waited, giving him the space he needed to find his words. Lucas took a deep breath, trying to steady the racing of his heart. "It's about Emily." Evelyn's expression softened, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Emily's been good for you, Lucas. I've noticed how much more at ease you seem these days." He nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat. "Yeah, she has. But it's more than that." Evelyn's smile faded slightly, her brow furrowing as she tried to understand what he was getting at. "What do you mean?" Lucas looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the fabric of his pants. "I think I'm falling in love with her, Mum." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of his confession. Lucas dared to glance up, searching his mother's face for any sign of disapproval. But what he saw there surprised him. There was no shock, no disappointment, just a deep, overwhelming joy that brought tears to her eyes. "Oh, Lucas," Evelyn breathed, reaching out to take his hand in hers. "That's wonderful." He blinked, taken aback by her reaction. "You're not upset?" Evelyn shook her head, her smile returning, this time brighter and more genuine. "How could I be upset about something like that? You deserve to find happiness, Lucas. And if Emily is the one who makes you feel that way, then I couldn't be happier for you." The relief that washed over him was almost overwhelming, and he felt a tear slip down his cheek before he could stop it. He hadn't realized just how much he needed her approval, her blessing, until this moment. "I was so worried," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't know if it would be too much, if it would complicate things between us. But I couldn't keep it to myself any longer." Evelyn squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Love is never a complication, Lucas. It's a gift, and you've been through so much. You deserve this. You both do." Lucas nodded, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the room's cozy atmosphere. "I haven't told her yet. I wanted to talk to you first, make sure I wasn't, I don't know, getting ahead of myself." His mother laughed softly, a sound filled with affection. "You've always been careful, Lucas. But sometimes you just have to take the leap. Trust yourself, and trust her." He smiled, the weight of his earlier anxiety lifting. "I will. Thanks, Mom." The evening was calm, the kind of stillness that seemed to wrap the world in a comforting embrace. Lucas sat in the living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting gentle shadows across the room. The table was set, the dishes carefully chosen, the wine chilling in the kitchen. Everything was ready, except for him. "Are you sure about this, Lucas?" Evelyn's voice, though gentle, held a hint of concern. She stood at the doorway, watching him with the careful eyes of a mother who had seen her son through the darkest of times. Lucas looked up at her, his heart racing. "I am, Mom. I've never been more sure of anything." She nodded, offering him a small smile. "Then it's going to be perfect." Lucas wanted to believe her, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He had imagined this night 100 times, rehearsed the words he wanted to say, but now that the moment was here, it felt monumental, overwhelming. He had faced so many challenges in his life, physical, emotional, but this was different. This was about opening his heart, about taking a leap into the unknown. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts, and Lucas's breath caught in his throat. He exchanged a quick glance with Evelyn, who gave him an encouraging nod before heading to the door. Emily stepped inside, her presence instantly warming the room. She wore a simple dress, nothing flashy, but it suited her, reflecting the understated elegance that Lucas had come to admire. She smiled at Evelyn, then turned her gaze to Lucas, her eyes softening as they met his. "Hi," she said, her voice light, but Lucas could hear the slight tremor of nerves. "Hi," he echoed, feeling the tension ease just a little. "Thanks for coming." "Wouldn't miss it for the world," she replied, moving closer. The dinner was simple, just as Lucas had planned. Roast chicken, a fresh salad, and Evelyn's famous apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, laughter mingling with the clink of silverware, but beneath it all was the unspoken anticipation of what was to come. Lucas could feel it in every glance, every smile that passed between him and Emily. After dessert, Evelyn excused herself, leaving Lucas and Emily alone in the dimly lit room. The atmosphere shifted, becoming more intimate, more charged with the emotions that had been building between them. "Emily," Lucas began, his voice steady, though his heart pounded in his chest. "There's something I need to say." She looked at him, her expression open, waiting. "What is it?" Lucas took a deep breath, his mind racing to find the right words. "These past few months, you've been more than just a therapist to me. You've been a friend, a source of strength, and someone I've come to care about deeply." Emily's eyes softened, a hint of something unspoken passing between them. "I care about you too, Lucas." He nodded, gathering his courage. "I've been thinking a lot about my life, about where I was and where I am now. And the truth is, I wouldn't be here, feeling this way, if it weren't for you." "Lucas," Emily started, but he gently cut her off. "No, let me finish," he said, his voice firmer now. "I don't know what the future holds, but I do know that I want to face it with you by my side. I know it's not conventional, that it's complicated, but I've never been one for easy paths." Emily's breath caught, her eyes wide with emotion as Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He held it out to her, his hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. "Emily Carson," he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Will you marry me?" For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Lucas watched as 1,000 emotions played across Emily's face, surprise, joy, and something deeper, something that mirrored his own feelings. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Lucas, I will." The relief that flooded through him was almost dizzying. He opened the box, revealing a simple, elegant ring that glinted softly in the candlelight. Emily's hand trembled slightly as she extended it toward him, and he slid the ring onto her finger, his heart swelling with a joy he had never known before. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling around them. It was real, and it was theirs. Later, as the night drew on, Lucas found himself outside, at the edge of the old soccer field where he had spent so many childhood days. Emily stood beside him, their hands intertwined. With a deep breath, he let go of her hand and took a step forward. His legs, strengthened by months of therapy, held firm. And then he took another step, and another, until he was walking across the field, Emily watching with tears in her eyes, her smile wide with pride. The morning sun streamed through the lace curtains of Lucas and Emily's new home, casting a golden glow over the room. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that comes with early mornings in the countryside. Outside, the leaves rustled gently in the breeze, a soft reminder of the life they were building here. Inside, the echoes of recent celebrations lingered, the faint scent of flowers, the last remnants of confetti caught in the corners of the room, and the warm memory of a day filled with love. Their wedding had been a simple affair, just as they had wanted. The ceremony took place in the garden, beneath an arch of white roses and ivy. Close friends and family gathered, their faces lit with joy as Lucas and Emily exchanged vows. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was perfect in its intimacy. The air had been filled with laughter, the kind that comes from shared histories and deep connections. Now, as the first light of day crept into their home, Emily stirred beside him, her hand resting on the small swell of her belly. They were expecting their first child, a boy they had already named Noah. The news had been met with overwhelming joy, especially from Evelyn, who had embraced her new role as a grandmother with the same love and dedication she had always shown Lucas. Emily turned to Lucas, her smile sleepy but content. "Good morning." "Morning," Lucas replied, his voice low so as not to disturb the peace of the moment. He reached out, his hand covering hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" "Tired, but happy," she said, her eyes twinkling with the anticipation of what was to come. "I still can't believe this is our life now." Lucas nodded, his heart full as he looked at her. "I know. Sometimes it feels like a dream." The early days of their marriage had been a blur of new experiences and adjustments. There were the usual challenges, learning to live together, balancing work and home, preparing for the baby. But there was also an undercurrent of quiet joy that made even the hardest days worth it. And through it all, Evelyn had been a constant presence, her wisdom and support invaluable as they navigated this new chapter. The weeks passed, each day bringing them closer to Noah's arrival. The nursery was ready, painted in soft blues and greys, the crib lined with the handmade quilt Evelyn had given them as a wedding gift. Emily spent hours arranging and rearranging the tiny clothes and toys, her excitement growing with each passing day. And then, one crisp autumn morning, the call came. Lucas was at work when he got the news. Emily was in labor. He rushed to the hospital, his mind a whirl of emotions, from fear to excitement to the overwhelming need to be by her side. Evelyn was already there when he arrived, her hand clasping Emily's as they breathed through the contractions together. The hours that followed were long and exhausting, but when Noah finally made his entrance into the world, everything else faded away. The room was filled with the sound of his first cries, a powerful, undeniable proof of life's resilience. Lucas held his son for the first time, his hands shaking as he marveled at the tiny, perfect being he and Emily had created. "He's beautiful," Evelyn whispered, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked at her grandson. Lucas nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. Emily was smiling, though exhausted, her eyes never leaving Noah as she reached out to touch his cheek. In the weeks that followed, their home was filled with the sounds of a newborn, Soft coos, hungry cries, the gentle hush of a lullaby. There were sleepless nights, moments of doubt, but also an overwhelming sense of love that seemed to grow with each passing day. Evelyn was there for every milestone, her presence a constant source of comfort and wisdom. As Lucas watched Noah grow, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. The challenges they had faced, the struggles they had overcome, all seemed to pale in comparison to the joy of holding his son in his arms, of sharing this life with Emily, of seeing his mother embrace her new role with such grace and love. And in those quiet moments, when the house was still and the only sound was the steady breathing of his sleeping family, Lucas felt a deep, unshakable peace. This was fulfillment. This was the life he had fought for, the life they had all built together. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always easy, but it was theirs, and it was beautiful. As he sat by the window, Noah cradled in his arms, Lucas looked out at the world beyond their home and felt a sense of contentment that was as strong as it was simple. And that's where today's story ends. A powerful reminder that even in our darkest moments, hope can find a way through, especially when we have those we love standing by our side. Lucas and Evelyn's journey shows us the incredible strength found in family, in perseverance, and in facing the unknown together. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next story we have for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What did this story mean to you? How do you stay hopeful in difficult times? Thanks for watching. And until next time, take care and keep believing in the power of love and resilience.